Instead, what we'll do is we'll give you a glass of great Kool-Aid. You know, for $2 a pitcher, that helps me get through these tough economic times. So I'm hoping you're going to really appreciate that. Okay. All right, here we go with, oh, she left, and that's probably a good idea. No. Going to move into large employer shared responsibility. Now, let me ask you this. How many of you have 50 or more employees? A good number of you. How many of you have a mixture of full-time and part-time employees? Okay, some of you still. Okay. How many of you know that you have under 50 employees? Okay, just a few of you. Okay. How many of you are close to 50 employees? Okay. We need to talk about this.
It's a variety.
Yes, a variety. And that's the problem. It's not going to apply to those of you who are small employers who definitely are small employers. You know, bear with me on this. Because even for those of you who are small employers, if business is good, you may want to add employees, you want to ramp up, you may look at merging with other companies, doing a lot of things that could make you a large employer. And if you're a large employer, you're going to be looking at these penalties. First of all, these are some of the issues that we'll be talking about. Penalties. Failure to offer coverage to full-time employees, the penalty for that. Failure to offer affordable coverage to full-time employees. Or failure to offer coverage with 60% minimum value. Okay. Affordable is a whole other issue, but that's a good question. Okay. Who is a large employer? We already talked a little bit about that at the start of the seminar. Controlled group. Are you considered to be a single employer, or because of the ownership interest of the owners of your company, are you part of a controlled group? And this is where it sneaks up on a lot of people. We'll talk about that in a moment, but just to give you an idea of what we're looking at, I dealt with a chain. It wasn't a chain. It was really a husband and wife who had opened a number of shops, small shops, hair salons. They didn't have more than 6 or 8 employees in any hair salon. They ran each hair salon separately, independently. They all had separate tax IDs, but they had a number of these. They had like 10 of them. They ran them all as separate companies. They wanted to know if they were a large employer. And the fact is that they were, because they owned all of these companies, which the government looks at to combine, you know, and determines them to be a large employer that is subject to this particular penalty. Okay? They are panicking. They're worried because they've never offered group coverage to anybody other than their managers in each salon, and now they're going to be required to offer group coverage to all of their full-time employees or pay a penalty. Okay? So, looking at some major problems, some major plan design and eligibility issues for this particular employer. Yes?
So for a full-time employee, we do internships and stuff in the summer,
Mm-hmm.
and then we have a lot of on-call employees where they'll come in and they'll do it for actually for a couple months and then they leave again.
Mm-hmm.
So do we have to offer insurance to those individuals?
We'll talk about interns, and we'll talk about, I don't have anything specific about on-call employees, but they're like part-time employees, and we'll talk about them. And the answer is yes, if they are a full-time employee based upon the number of hours they work. You will have to include them. I saw another hand go over. Okay. Control group rules. Are you a parent subsidiary group? Are you a brother-sister group? Where can this occur that can sneak up on you and surprise you? We'll talk about those in a second. Identifying who is a full-time employee goes to the interns, temps, part-time employees, minimum essential coverage, MEC, affordability, the question that you had, premium tax credits, and actuarial and minimum value. These are all issues that are related to the large employer shared responsibility penalty. We're not going to go into all these in detail, but we are going to go into some of these. Okay, so beginning in 2014, this penalty is going to be applied this way. If you are a large employer and you do not offer what they call minimum essential coverage, and that's basically group health coverage, to all full-time employees and their children to age 26, so no more of this employee-only coverage, you will be taxed $167 per month per full-time employee after the first 30. You're entitled to exclude the first 30 employees in making this calculation, in which you have a full-time employee enrolled in an exchange plan, Cover Oregon in Oregon, who will receive a tax credit. Let's go through that again. If you do not offer coverage to any of your full-time employees, if you have any of your employees enrolled in an exchange program and they receive a tax subsidy or a cost-sharing subsidy through the exchange, you're going to pay a penalty of $167 per month, but you may exclude the first 30 employees in making that calculation. What happens if you do offer coverage to your full-time employees and their children to age 26? If the coverage is not very good coverage, it has less than a 60% minimum value, that's kind of its actuarial value kind of thing, or the self-only cost is greater than 9.5% of the employee's income, and by affordability, we're talking about the box 1 on their W-2, okay? That amount for the employee of the self-only coverage, the employer will be taxed $250 per month for each full-time employee who enrolls in an exchange plan and receives a tax credit. Okay. We're going to go through some examples of how this works. So a large employer is one who had an average of 50 or more full-time employees, including full-time equivalent employees, FTEs, as determined on a controlled group basis. We're going to break down that particular sentence into its parts so that you can understand each sentence, each part of that. A full-time employee is one who works, on average, 30 hours per week. So that's the criteria. If you work 30 hours per week, you're a full-time employee. Now, many of you in the past may have had 35 hours as your criteria. Some of you may have required the full 40 hours. Some of you may have less. But now the criteria for providing coverage, if you are a large employer, under this particular penalty requirement, is 30 hours per week. The number of full-time equivalent employees is determined by adding together the work hours of all part-time employees, which include interns, those you call in and out, and seasonal employees on certain circumstances, and dividing by 30. That's going to tell me how many full-time equivalent employees that you have. You add together the number of full-time employees with the number of full-time equivalent employees. If that number is 50 or more, you are a large employer who is subject to this penalty. The transition rule for 2013 says that this may be different from what you have in your handout. I think I switched out this information. But this is something you don't really have to write down, but I thought it was probably more important than what was in the handout. Or did I might have gotten it, because okay, good, because we redid the handout last night, right? So, yeah. But I was still making changes last night. Okay. The employer may use any 6 or more consecutive months in 2013 that it chooses to determine whether or not the employer is a large employer in 2014. Remember, you're going to look back to the last year, and you're going to determine how many full-time employees and full-time equivalent employees you had last year to determine whether or not you are a large employer this year. Now, let's say that your employee population fluctuates. This year you are subject to, 2014, you're subject to the large employer requirement because in 2013 you had more than 50 employees. But then during 2014, you go under 50 employees. In 2015, you are not a large employer. Okay? You may potentially make benefit changes and things during that year, but then once again, if your employee population goes up in 2014, or 2015, then in 2016, you'll once again be subject to it. So it's going to cause a little bit of fluctuation, yes?
Not every person who enrolled in an exchange plan was going to receive a tax credit.
No, good question. Did you ever, all of you hear that? Not everybody who enrolls in an exchange program is going to receive a tax credit. It's based upon a couple of things. Number one, what their income is. Okay, it's based upon percentage of poverty level income, but that's pretty high. And the affordability of the coverage for them. So we'll go through that a little bit, but a lot more people have potential for receiving subsidies or premium tax credits than you might think, are probably entitled to. It's a very high number. So there are two issues regarding seasonal employees that we're going to be talking about. Number one, whether or not you count them and how you count them for the large employer determination. Excuse me. My allergies, like I was talking about. And determining if they are full-time employees. So you must look at seasonal employees in two ways. Number one, do they make you a large employer because you have seasonal employees? And number two, if they are seasonal employees, are they full-time employees or part-time employees? Seasonal employees are defined by the regulations as employees whose employment is exclusively performed at certain seasons or periods of the year and which is not continuous or carried on throughout the year. It also includes retail employees during the holiday seasons. Large employer have an exception for seasonal workers, and this once again, is the convoluted way the regulations lay out things for you. If your workforce exceeds 50 full-time employees for 120 days or less in a calendar year, last year, well, this year for 2014, if you go over 50 full-time employees for 120 days or less, and the reason that you go over the 50 employees for the 120 days or less is because you have seasonal employees, you're not a large employer. Does that rule make any sense to you? Because I had to read it about 50 times before it kind of made sense to me. Okay. You have to look at every 120-day period and say, did we go over 50 employees during any 120-day period in 2013 for 2014? If we did, is this only because we had seasonal employees during that time? If you go over 50 employees for more than 120 days, you're a large employer, regardless of whether that is caused by seasonal employers or not. Okay. Convoluted rules. Now, you as employers have nothing to do all day long except for worry about your health coverage, right? You're not really running a business, are you? Trying to make a profit. That's the problem with this. It is so confusing and so complex, and unfortunately, these are issues that you're going to have to be at least aware of and kind of know how to apply. That's the reason we're going to be talking about it. Controlled group of employers. This is that awful area I was talking about, like with those hair salons or hair shops. I'm going to start out by saying this before we really get into what we're talking about here. Most of you, unless you own your own companies, who work for the company and you do the human resources functions, or you are the human resources department, are not always going to know what ownership interests the owners of your company have in other companies. They're not going to tell you that. In fact, you can ask them that, and they may get angry with you for even asking that question. You own other companies. But you know what you're going to have to do? You're going to have to tell the owners of your company, if you own other companies, it is possible that owning other companies is going to make us be a large employer that is subject to this large employer penalty, and we are going to have to comply with this rule, or we're going to be paying penalties. Okay? That's the least that you're going to have to do, and hope that they're willing to level with you on what ownership interest they may have in other companies. Why is this necessary? Under Internal Revenue Code, in ERISA, and the Affordable Care Act, there are controlled group rules. And what this says is this. If you have multiple companies, multiple employers, you are considered to be a single employer under a couple of different analyses. Number one, if a parent company owns 80% or more of a subsidiary, and you see a lot of wholly owned subsidiaries, your company owns another company, 100%. They are both considered to be a single employer. Okay? Their common control rules say you are a single employer, and you must add together all the employees of both companies to see if you're a large employer. Yes?
What if one of them is a U.S. company and the other one is an overseas company?
Okay, there are good question. There are exceptions for who this applies to, and I believe there's an exception for the foreign companies, because there are a lot of exceptions for foreign companies, or even for policies that are provided only for employees that are overseas. But we may need to check that again, because I don't want to give you bad advice. If you could write that one down too, okay? But I think that I'm right on that one, okay? There's only 20,000 pages of regulations. I'm sorry, I don't have them committed to memory. Okay, another way that you can have multiple companies be a single employer, and you have to count all the employees of all the companies and add them together to determine if you have 50 or more employees, is under the commonly controlled rules, brother-sister companies. These are really difficult to understand, okay? But what these requirements say is that if you have the same 5 or fewer owners who own multiple companies, have ownership interests in multiple companies, and together they have effective 50% control of all the companies, and there's a way to measure that, and they have actual combined ownership of all the companies of 80%, there's a different way to measure that, then you have a controlled group of brother-sister companies. You must add together the employees of all of those companies that are within this controlled group to make you a large employer if you have more than 50 employees. Okay, that's the reason why this is so convoluted. Now, these rules have been in effect for a long time. They apply for non-discrimination, and that sneaked up on a lot of employers. They didn't think that they had the requisite number of employees or the requisite types of coverage that would be subject to non-discrimination rules, and they found out that, hey, we're providing benefits for one company and not for another company, or for at different levels in each company. Yes, we have had a discriminatory plan, things like that. So these rules have been in place for a long time, and they also apply to taxation. So there are some restrictions and things like that due to commonly controlled group rules for taxation. Okay, so here's some simple hypotheticals. Number one, Calories Unlimited, a great company. They don't care what kind of food they're going to serve you, okay? They own 80% or more of all-you-can-eat ice cream parlors and Pappy Dave's Spam on a Stick, okay? All of these companies together are a commonly controlled group, or a controlled group, because a parent owns more than 80% of two subsidiary companies. So you have to add all of the employees together from all of these companies to determine if you're a large employer. Another way that this can occur is this, hypothetical number two. You have a parent and chain of 80% subsidiaries in which Wed and Endem Inc. In fact, the reason I came up with that is my dad was a minister, a Methodist minister, and when I became a lawyer, we talked about selling a group package, which he would do the wedding and I would do the divorce, and we'd sell it all as a group package. So we're going to have the Elvis Chapel, and we're going to also set up a company called Last Stop Services, where he would do the funeral and I would do the probate. We thought that this was a great idea. Never worked out. I don't know why. But anyway, in this particular hypothetical, the parent company owns 80 or up to 80% of Elvis Chapel, and Elvis Chapel owns 80% of Last Stop Services. This is a commonly controlled group. You add up all the employees of all the companies to determine whether or not they're a large employer. Another one here. Mabel and Leroy started Gross Groceries, selling all the things that they didn't think people would want to buy. It was a big hit. They owned 100% of this together. They also had a lot of things that didn't sell from Gross Groceries. They opened another grocery outlet called Stale Dated, Wilted and More. Also a big hit. They own 90% of this because their friend Sally said, you know what, I want to do something. Will you let me buy 10% of this? Let her buy 10%. Mabel and Leroy own 90% of it. Sally owns 10% of it. They also opened a lot of another store, Rods and Reels Sports Supply, because anybody coming in from groceries that didn't have money in these tough economic times would give them a shotgun or a rod and reel, and they'd give them some groceries. And so they developed this inventory. But they had a friend, Randy, who also had a grocery store and wanted to open the second business. So they each own 50% of this Rods and Reels Sports Supply. Here's the analysis, and this is a very simplified analysis. Mabel and Leroy own effective control 50% of all three companies, okay? They own, you can see, 90% of this one, 100% of this, 50% of this. So the effective control 50% level is satisfied. But they must also own a controlling 80% interest in each company for common control to exist. The only companies that they own more than 80% or 80% or more in are Gross Groceries, Stale Dated, and More. They only own 50% in this company, so the only companies within the common control group are Gross Groceries, Stale Dated, More, and if Mabel and Leroy have a company that they run themselves, that would also be part of the commonly controlled group. And you would add all the employees together from those particular employers. But any employees in Rods and Reels Sports Supply would not be included in that. Now, to do this analysis, I don't think I did this.